God of nations, at thy feet, in the bonds of love we meet. Hear our voices, we entreat. God, defend our free land. Guard Pacific's triple star from the shafts of strife and war. Make her praises heard afar. God, defend New Zealand. Men of every creed and race, gather here before thy face, asking thee to bless this place. God, defend our free land. From dissension, every hate, and corruption, guard our state. Make our country good and great. God, defend New Zealand.
I'll be with you shortly. That was for you, Andrew. Thank you, David Ross. I'll go one more. Okay. All right, today's lesson is given retrospectively to the Aussies in the house and prospectively to the rest of us, because this is the nearest Sunday to Waitangi Day. Most countries have a national day, and it was interesting to Google that. It's always about the same things, identity and heritage, but around the world there's all kinds of interesting names for them. There's Independence Day, Freedom Day, Constitution Day, Revolution Day, Throne Day, Liberation Day, Nation Day, Statehood Day, Republic Day. And as you can see and know, ours is called Waitangi Day, named after the place where the treaty was signed. And the Māori word Waitangi means the place of noisy waters or weeping waters, probably a reference to a nearby waterfall. But wherever you live, when Nation Days are celebrated, it's an annual reminder about identity. And for us, it tells us when we became a nation. It tells us about identifying our culture. It reminds us, the rest of the world, what we are, where we are, who we are, and even what we stand for. So along with our flag, and you can see the national Māori flag there and the New Zealand flag, along with the flag, our anthem, and the Nation Days itself, these are areas and parts of our calendar that allow us just to be proud and to feel a sense of patriotism. And the things that we're going to talk about today are things about the things that unite us. Because despite our difference racially, culturally, religiously, the treaty itself and the wording of the treaty actually signify unity. And we'll see that in several ways today. And that's a really important thing to stress, because at the moment the treaty is politically very divisive. So I have a task this morning of looking at the past, reflecting on the present, and perhaps shaping our future in a positive Christian context. The text that I want to refer to today is one that you're familiar with. It's Ephesians chapter 2, and yes, I know that Paul was talking about Jews and Gentiles, but I think in this text there are some clear principles, and I've highlighted some of those, that actually have direct relevance to a multicultural or bicultural society such as New Zealand is. So let's hear what Paul says, and then later we'll make some applications to what we're talking about today. Don't forget that you Gentiles used to be outsiders. You were called uncircumcised heathens by the Jews, who were proud of their circumcision, even though it affected only their bodies and not their hearts. In those days, you were living apart from Christ. You were excluded from citizenship among the people of Israel, and you did not know the covenant promises God had made to them. You lived in this world without God and without hope, but now you've been united with Christ Jesus. Once you were far away from God, but now you've been brought near to him through the blood of Christ. So it's quite an interesting thing if you think about what Paul is doing in this text. He's reminding them of the importance of remembering the path of the past that had brought them to the present privilege of being in Christ. This is not only true spiritually, this is just as true culturally and also historically, to look at the past and to understand the present. Memory is really something that's important. Memory provides us a context to understand the daily reality we live in. We remember lots of things. We remember pain, we remember enjoyment, we remember people, we remember information, and we remember important events. FYI, Valentine's is coming up, gentlemen. The past gives shape to our present, and that's what I want to consider this morning. There was a time not that long ago I touched an electric fence. I don't do that anymore, and so that informed me immediately that I shouldn't be doing that. There's another thing that remembering does. If we remember the past, it gives us a sense of belonging, okay? And my being a part of this audience goes back 30 years, but my coming to Christ was a lot longer ago. And so when I walk in, often I think of May 3rd, 1969, 9:30 Saturday morning. When we look at our past, it gives us a sense of our fit in life. It allows us to feel important, to celebrate our unique identity as a nation. Let's continue with what Paul says in Ephesians 2, the connection between the past and present. For Christ himself has brought peace to us. He united Jews and Gentiles into one people when in his own body, on the cross, he broke down the hostility that separated us. He did this by ending the system of law with its commandments and regulations. He made peace between Jews and Gentiles by creating in himself one new people from the two groups. Together as one body, Christ reconciled both groups to God by means of his death on the cross, and our hostility towards each other was put to death. I don't care which end of the scale you or I are on when it comes to combating an enemy. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But we can all put to death enmity. We can all pursue the peace that our God has shown towards all men. The book of Ephesians is my personal favorite in the New Testament, and ironically, it was the first document translated and printed in Māori. When you think of Māori culture, I've married into Māori culture and I've learned a bit along the way, but all of the songs, all of the history, all of the traditions, all of the speeches even, the ceremonies, all of that was retained in here and came from here orally. And so when the missionaries came, one of the first tasks was to select those amongst them who were linguists, and they very quickly learned how to write in English phonetically the way those words sounded. And so Māori from that point onwards are going to have a recourse to a written text, just as you and I do. The interesting thing about this particular text is this was the first translated part of the New Testament, Ephesians and Philippians. And it introduced to the Māori nation, the God of nations, the first line in our national anthem. Andrew's here, so we have to have some jokes today, a little bit of humour, because it can be a serious subject. First one is the signing, 1840. Young Māori boy on his father's shoulders, looking out at the beauty of the bay and the beauty of the land they live in. And he says, one day, my son, all of this will be theirs. These are not mine, they're political. These were in newspapers, okay? So newspapers used to reflect what the internet now is. It knows everything. The second one is actually the signing, and you can see Māori chiefs there, and you see representatives of the British Empire. And the signing is much like any contract today or covenant. Sign here, sign here, sign here. And the British representative said, okay, it's hastily and inexpertly drawn up. It's ambiguous and contradictory in context and chaotic in execution. But, there's always a but we get Bastion Point, the Raglan Golf Course, Athletic Park, and half of Dunedin and Greymouth, and a holiday once a year. And he ends by saying, that should amuse our gracious Queen. If we fast forward 100 years from the signing in 1840 to 1940, this was a huge celebration in New Zealand. And many people returned to the actual place that David Ross was talking about. They went up north to the place of Waitangi, and reenactments were held. There's a picture here of a waka that was built to celebrate this occasion. And if you look at the paddlers, the first one holding a white paddle on the right is Bernardine's grandpa, Hinari Rika Hiki. And this year, in 1940, all across the country, the celebrations were New Zealand is coming of age. It was a marker point. Memorials were unveiled, there were music and drama festivals, there were historical reenactments, books were written and published. It was on the newspaper headlines all across the land. But sadly, Māori and the treaty itself took a back seat. Okay. This is my history hat. It's not really a history hat, I just never preached in a hat, so I'm going to do that today. It is impossible. It is too? Thank you. It's impossible, and in my notes that's capitalized, underlined, and highlighted. It is impossible to understand the present without the past. So I'm going to try and whiz through this and make some sense of it. As Christians, we know that principle to be true, because as we look at the New Testament, we have to look through the lenses of the Old Testament to get the full meaning. And so as we look at the treaty and New Zealand today and some of the challenges and disputes, we have to consider the past. So in 1250 to 1300, 400 years before the arrival of the first European explorer, 400 years, these expert Polynesian navigators left East Polynesia and they discovered this country, and they simply used their knowledge of ocean currents, prevailing winds, and they navigated by the stars. And when they arrived, they called Aotearoa, with reference initially just to the North Island. Years later, many years later, Abel Tasman comes along. He was a Dutch explorer. He was the first European to arrive in New Zealand and set foot on it and begin to map it. He came here after discovering Tasmania, and he named our country after a province in the Netherlands called Zeeland, Z-E-E. Then the British arrived, 1769, Captain James Cook. He was a British explorer. He rediscovered New Zealand. He had been commissioned by the British Science Society. This was a scientific investigation. They were looking for a place that they had already named and thought might exist, and it was called Terra Australis. It was a hypothetical continent. They said, if we've got continents up north, there should be some down south. And I think even the Greeks said that should be the way it works. So he was sent to see if that was true. And of course it was, when they reached Australia. In 1791, 11 ships arrived in Sydney. And that same year, there were whaling ships. One of them came to New Zealand, and whaling and sealing became a major industry in the next 100 years. In 1814, Samuel Marsden was the assistant chaplain to the penal colony of New South Wales, which was Australia's first colony. And the first sermon preached in New Zealand on Christmas Day at Ohi Bay in Northland, in the Bay of Islands, was given by Samuel Marsden. And a Ngāpuhi chief, Ruatara, we have at least two Ngāpuhi here this morning, Bernardine and Corbin, and this chief Ruatara had met Marsden in Australia many years before. And Ruatara, I guess at the time, because nothing was in print, he actually translated while Marsden was preaching. And the text was Luke chapter 2. Marsden was preaching about bringing you glad tidings of great joy, a Saviour is born, and the sermon was from Luke chapter 2. 1831, the 13 northern Ngāpuhi chiefs sent a letter of petition to the current King of England, William IV, And they were seeking protection from a French naval ship. The French were saying, this place is pretty good, maybe we can grab it for France. And so that is one of the reasons the treaty was pushed through rather quickly. But the Māori chiefs from up north were petitioning him about the naval ship, but also they were concerned about the intertribal conflicts that were going on in New Zealand between tribes. They were especially concerned about lawlessness amongst British people in Northland. In 1835, the first Christian scripture to be printed in Māori was done up north, and the texts were Ephesians and Philippians. In 1836 and 7, the entire New Testament was available in Māori, and we know the bulk of the Bible is the Old Testament. It took until 1868 before that was available. But Māori were very fast learners. The translation was done in 1835. By 1845, 50% of Māori could read in te reo. By 1867, all New Zealand schools taught only in English. And one of the sad things about the story is, I know this from Bernardine's mother and father, they were from a generation where they spoke Māori in the home. They spoke Māori on the farm, in the community, at the marae. At every festival occasion, they sang in Māori, but if they spoke in Māori at school, they were physically punished for doing so. So changes were underway. 1835, the Declaration of Independence of the United Tribes of New Zealand. 34 Ngāpuhi chiefs signed this. And by 1839, before the treaty was signed, another 18 from Waikato and the Hawke's Bay had also signed this Declaration of Independence. And it basically asserted that New Zealand was an independent Māori state and that power resided fully with Māori. James Busby was appointed by the Governor of New South Wales. He was a British resident of New Zealand, and he was appointed to handle and look after Māori affairs and Māori interests. And he described this document, the Declaration of Independence of 1835, as the Magna Carta of New Zealand. And I don't know if you know Magna Carta, but it was an historic document written long before the 1800s that said even politicians, even monarchs are subject to the law. So it was an important step. This was a bold decision for Indigenous or Native power and rights. In 1837, we have the unusual situation of New Zealand, or Britain, deciding to colonise New Zealand, and the New Zealand Association became the New Zealand Company in 1839. And the first immigrants arrived in January 1940, before the treaty, and they arrived in Wellington. The second settlement was Whanganui, and then in New Plymouth, 1841, Nelson, 1842, and by 1843, members of the Churches of Christ had arrived in Nelson. Wakefield, in discussing the possibility of colonising New Zealand, told the British House of Commons that this was, and this is a quote, the fittest place in the world for colonisation. This is the place to be. This is this is nearest to Eden we're ever going to see. And of course he was right, but I think in some ways they went about it wrongly. In 1840, we have Te Tiriti o Waitangi, signed by Governor Captain William Hobson. He had been appointed as a lieutenant governor of a colony that didn't yet exist, which is a bit interesting. In 1840, the same year, a man called George Clark was made the Māori Protectorate. This organisation was formed by Governor Hobson and operated by George Clark. And basically, he was the chief protector of Māori affairs. His job was to look after Māori interests and to negotiate land sales with Māori. Bit of a conflict of interest there, to say the least. 1844, the British Parliament declared the treaty injudicious, which I had to look up, unwise, untenable, not really realistic, not going to work. That's what the British Parliament determined as early as 4 years after it was signed. They made another decision which has caused trouble ever since. They said that if Māori land is uncultivated out there in the bush, the mountains, if they're not using it to grow crops, it needs to be taxed. If the tax is not paid, the land will be confiscated. Yeah. 1847, on a more positive note, the new governor, Grey, he enabled Māori rangatira, high-ranking chiefs, to be appointed to the court, the legal system. That was a good move. He also allowed Māori police to be recruited, which again was a good move. But in 1852, the New Zealand Parliament was set up independent of Britain, and there was no Māori representation. 1863, on the eve of the British invasion of the lands we call Waikato, another act was passed by the New Zealand Parliament called the New Zealand Settlement Act. And Māori who refused to pledge allegiance to the new Queen, Queen Victoria, Wikitoria, or if they fought to protect their land, they had it confiscated. 4 million acres. 1864, the New Zealand government took over Māori affairs, and now those are in the full control of Pākehā rather than Māori. We have a really unusual situation in the middle of the 19th century where we have two monarchs. King Patatau Te Wherewhero was crowned in 1858 in an effort to stem the loss of Māori land to arriving settlers. This was the beginning of the Kingitanga movement, and the King movement today, of course, continues. Breaking news. Bernardine is a direct descendant of King Patatau's daughter. So we have a princess in the house. And I'm here to tell you that when we travel, I get to carry her cases. And every day when she gets hungry, I get to serve a meal to the princess. Governor George Grey issued an ultimatum in 1863 to Māori. They were required to pledge allegiance to Queen Victoria. 3 days later, the troops invaded Waikato. They crossed the Mangatawhiri stream. There's a stream in Waikato, it's not big, but Māori basically said, this is our line in the sand. Land this side of that river is ours and will not be touched. And that was the beginning of the Waikato Wars. And the battles that took place in our city, Tauranga, were because Māori were coming from the east coast through this peninsula over into the Waikato. And so Cameron said, we're going to put a stop to that. Okay, the Settlement Act allowed government of New Zealand to seize land from rebellious Māori in the land wars. So the defence of the land that was theirs led to the confiscation of Māori land. The New Zealand land wars lasted from 1845 to 72. 736 colonial troops died and 2,254 Māori died. History used to refer to this as the Māori Wars. That's a terrible misnomer because Māori did not initiate this conflict. They were renamed the New Zealand Wars, and today, more correctly, the New Zealand Land Wars. Now today we have lots of political issues that are on people's minds and hearts and are being argued about and put forward. We have inflation, we have involvement in overseas conflicts, we have protests concerning climate change. But imagine coming home at the end of a busy day and finding that your place was no longer your place. That's literally what happened. Dr. O'Malley is a New Zealand historian and an expert in Pākehā Māori relations. He says, for Pākehā, as for Māori, ownership was the most important political issue in the 19th century, and that's on our government website. But O'Malley says, if we ask what was the cause of the New Zealand Wars, the obvious one was land, whenua. In short, the Māori had it, the British wanted it. So the land purchases, the deeds for Wellington, written by the New Zealand Company in 1839, 5 months before the treaty. So 5 months before there is an actual colony of New Zealand. January 1840, the first immigrant ship arrives in Wellington, and that was 3 weeks before the treaty was even signed. People were here to claim land. May 21, 1840, Governor Hobson proclaimed British sovereignty over the North Island by cession. Another word I had to look up. It simply means the transfer of rights. This was yours, now it's theirs. And they claimed right over the South Island by discovery 500 years after Māori had discovered it. And this violated the treaty just within months of it being written. Because 2 months earlier, the treaty had guaranteed tino rangatiratanga full chiefly authority over their lands. Let me take you back to when I was a young man. I got my first pocket money was 2 and 6, and I can see Colin smiling because he knows what that was like. It's equivalent to 25 cents today. And the New Zealand coat of arms was printed on that coin. So I saw this once a week if I was well behaved. The coat of arms has as its central feature the British crown, and then we have a European woman holding a New Zealand flag, basically representing at the time the British immigrants, and then a Māori rangatira holding a taiaha. And all of the symbols in the middle are basically representing our agriculture and our industry. Historical tension and present tension centers around terminology. Words are incredibly important. In the British language and to the British mind, sovereignty meant supreme power, the dominant authority. To the Māori ear and mind and heart, rangatiratanga meant self-determination, self-rule, chiefly authority. And that is the word that's actually in the controversial Article 2, if you've heard that being mentioned in the recent week. Article 2 says, Her Majesty the Queen of England confirms and guarantees to the chief and tribes of New Zealand and to the respective families and individuals thereof the full, exclusive and undisturbed possession of their lands, their estates, their forests and their fisheries, and any other properties which they may collectively or individually possess, so long as it is their wish and desire to retain the same in their possession. That's Article 2 that Māori are saying should be left alone and maintained. And the treaty goes on to say that only the government, only the British Crown could be engaged in the sale of land rather than a private land company. When we look at the transfer of land, it's a really sad story. To me it is. Today we understand a legal transaction of any kind as the exchange of a fair monetary amount equaling the value of what you're buying, in this case land. And so in 1847, indeed 1840, and for hundreds of years, all of the country was owned by Māori. But you can see the progression of the dates, and by the time we get to 1939, less than 100 years, only a small scattering of land was still in the possession of Māori. One of the problems and explanations of how this could happen was that beside monetary payment being equal to the value of land, was that the land was owned tribally, locally, communally. The iwi collectively owned the land, but British colonisers quickly figured that the best way to do it was to offer an enticing amount of goods or money that would appeal to an individual, and so the sale would go ahead. The South Island, we had the same picture, exactly the same concept. In 1844, owned in its entirety by Māori. Less than 10 years after the treaty, the whole middle section of the South Island has transferred into the possession of British and Pākehā residents. The value of that, which you can't see on this map, was £2,000. £2,000 sounds like a lot. The internet tells me that that equivalent value today is $278,000, which would give you a half deposit on a residential section here in Tauranga. That's 20 million acres of land. So by 1860, the Stewart Island at the bottom of our country is the only land that Māori owned. 500 years of occupation. Maori lost land rights and land within 25 years. So if you've ever wondered about or even criticised the monetary settlements to Māori tribes in our day, this explains the problem. This explains the mess that the government has tried to compensate and put to right the wrongs of yesteryear. So for all the protests, petitions, land court appeals, negotiation and monetary grants, the past explains our present. So a big challenge, a big challenge. So Edward Dury was born at that 1940 centenary event of Waitangi. He was the first Māori appointed as a judge of the New Zealand courts. He was a High Court judge. He was the chief judge of the Māori Land Court, and he was the chairman of the Waitangi Tribunal. Look at what he says. The Treaty of Waitangi is not just a Bill of Rights for Māori, it's a Bill of Rights for Pākehā too. It is the treaty that gives Pākehā the right to be here. Without the treaty, there would be no lawful authority for the Pākehā presence in this part of the South Pacific. The Pākehā are tangata tiriti, those who belong to the land by right of that treaty. So Dury is very cleverly showing that the treaty rights apply both to Māori and to Pākehā. Pākehā are tangata tiriti. We're people of New Zealand by virtue of a treaty, an agreement. Māori are tangata whenua, people of the land. But for Māori, it was never really about ownership. This is a very European mindset. Their relationship with the land was they regarded themselves as stewards and guardians and custodians and caretakers of the land. Let me quickly introduce you to three well-known Māori, depending on your age. You've met this guy on occasion if you've opened your wallet and briefly seen his picture before you spent it. Aparana Ngata had a Māori father and a Scottish mother and grandmother. He was the first Māori to receive a university education and was awarded the bachelor's and master's degree. If you've done that, you know that's quite a bit of work. He could have become a very prominent lawyer, could become a very prosperous man, but he became a brilliant politician in Parliament, had he worked tirelessly to improve cultural and economic welfare for Māori New Zealanders. One of his many quotes, and he spoke for Māori at the 1940. If you're interested, it's an interesting speech. It's online. You can hear his voice and hear what he said. Very gracious, but he does mention some of the wrongs that were done. He said, "There is one law for Māori and Pākehā. The Treaty of Waitangi ordained it so." So if you've heard of some of the comments and mindset of David Seymour, they would agree on one half of that statement. He was revered as an academic. He was honoured as a statesman by both Pākehā and Māori alike. He was largely responsible for the revival and survival of Māoridom in the 20th century. And because he believed that the treaty made Māori and Pākehā united as citizens of the Kingdom of Britain, he urged Māori to fight alongside the British in World War I, and the Māori battalion became legendary. Perhaps more familiar is this woman, Dame Whina Cooper. She was born in Hokianga, up north, 1895. She worked alongside Aparana Ngata, and she set up with him Māori land development schemes. The remaining land, they decided, should be productive and should benefit Māori owners. She was the president of the Māori Women's Welfare League. Bernadine is our resident member of the same league, as was her nana in days gone past. She was a highly respected kuia. She was an elder. She began her early life in the honourable profession of teacher. She's most famous perhaps for her land march, and that's what's pictured here. In 1975, she decided to march from the Te Hapua Marae in the far north to Wellington, 1,001 kilometres. She presented a petition with 60,000 signatures to stop ongoing land seizure in her day, in the 70s, up north. She devoted her life to church and community activities. She was awarded the DBE, the Dame of the British Empire, which is the feminine equivalent of knighthood. She was made a member of the Order of New Zealand, the highest civic honour for a New Zealander, and her biography called her the Mother of the Nation. Notice what she said. "The seed I would like to plant in your heart is a vision of Aotearoa where all our people can live together in harmony and share the wisdom from each culture." You know, whenever you look to the past, whether it's your personal past or our national past, even our congregational past, we're going to find some skeletons in the closet, right? Mistakes have been made, mistreatment, injustice, inhumanity, but these nation days are an opportunity to celebrate what's good about being a New Zealander and to make a commitment now in our hearts and minds to make the future a better place. Let me quickly tie up Ephesians and how it relates, in my mind at least, to Waitangi. In the Old Testament, the covenant, which is a treaty, a legal binding document. In the Old Testament and the New Testament, and even today, this has the same meaning. It's an agreement between two or more parties that has associated responsibilities and associated benefits for both sides. And that's what it means today. That's what a treaty means today. Citizenship, the status of being a citizen. Again, privileges, rights, and responsibilities. One new people from two groups. Paul was applying that to Jew and Gentile. I'm saying it's equally applicable to Māori and Pākehā today. This is our national identity, and it's possible. Not easy, but it's possible. But it has to start here, and start here. And it has to issue every time we speak about these things, especially in a Christian context. One new people of two groups is possible, but it takes a required coordinated effort. If you think back to Henari's waka, those guys with all their muscle and strength pulling that back, if they're all doing that on Henari's side and the other guys are having their morning tea break, there's movement, but it's like that irritating thing on your computer that just does this. No actual forward progress, just circling around. So today, Waitangi, I believe, is a great opportunity to celebrate patriotism, to celebrate nationhood and unity, cultural diversity, and the privilege of being a Kiwi. God bless New Zealand, mā te atua e manaki Aotearoa. What's the Christian response to Waitangi Day? Something to think about this week. Me mahi tahi tātou mō te oranga o te katoa. We should work together for the well-being of everyone. Sounds to me like some Māori have been reading the scripture, because it sounds like what Paul said, Galatians 6:10, well, let us work together for the good of all, especially those of the family of faith. Thank you for your attention.